Have you ever wondered why your adult children seem to be pulling away from you despite all your best intentions to help and guide them? You call with love in your heart, you offer advice from decades of experience, and you genuinely want what's best for them. Yet somehow your phone calls get shorter, family gatherings become less frequent, and that warm connection you once shared feels increasingly distant. The truth is, many loving parents unknowingly use daily phrases that push their children away, creating walls instead of bridges. You're not doing this on purpose, but these seemingly innocent statements accumulate over time like tiny cuts that eventually leave deep wounds. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward rebuilding those precious relationships you've worked so hard to nurture. The challenge isn't that you don't love your children or that they don't love you back. The real issue lies in how we communicate that love as our children transition into full adulthood. Many of us continue using parenting language that worked when they were younger, not realizing that what once felt protective now feels controlling. We offer solutions when they need empathy. We share comparisons when they need validation, and we give lectures when they need conversation. These daily communication habits, repeated over months and years, slowly erode the mutual respect that healthy adult relationships require. Your children begin to feel judged rather than supported, inadequate rather than capable, and eventually they start limiting contact to protect their emotional well-being. What makes this particularly painful is that these communication patterns often stem from our deepest love and concern. When you tell your daughter about how things were different when you were her age, you're trying to offer perspective and wisdom. When you ask your son what's wrong because he sounds tired, you're expressing care and attention. When you share stories about other families or offer advice about their choices, you believe you're being helpful and engaged. The disconnect happens because your adult children hear these messages differently than you intend them. And over time, they begin to associate your calls and visits with feelings of inadequacy and frustration. The very love you're trying to express becomes the source of distance in your relationship. This pattern is incredibly common among parents who raise their children with dedication and care, only to find themselves confused by the growing emotional distance in their adult relationships. You might find yourself thinking that your children have become ungrateful or overly sensitive, when in reality, they're responding to communication patterns that make them feel perpetually criticized. The good news is that recognizing these patterns is the first step toward changing them. Once you understand how certain daily statements impact your adult children, you can begin replacing them with words that strengthen rather than strain your relationships. This isn't about walking on eggshells or avoiding honest communication, but rather about learning to express your love in ways that your children can receive and appreciate. Today, you're going to learn about 9 specific statements that many loving parents use daily, often without realizing their cumulative impact on adult children. These aren't terrible phrases used by bad parents, but rather common expressions that reveal deeper communication patterns that need adjustment. You'll see how these statements fall into 3 categories that systematically undermine adult children's confidence and autonomy. More importantly, you'll discover practical ways to transform these patterns into communication that strengthens your relationships rather than straining them. By the end of our time together, you'll have a clear roadmap for rebuilding the warm, connected relationship you both want and deserve. To illustrate this, let me tell you a story about a father named Bryce who genuinely loved his children but couldn't understand why they kept finding excuses to skip family gatherings. Bryce was 58 years old and had built a successful career as an insurance broker, earning a reputation for being someone who could solve problems and offer practical advice. He had raised his 2 children, Kendra and Ashton, with dedication and involvement, always making sure they knew he was available to help with any challenge they faced. In his mind, he was the kind of father who stayed engaged in his children's lives, offering guidance and wisdom gained from decades of experience. Yet somehow, the warm family dinners and holiday celebrations he had envisioned for his later years were becoming increasingly strained and infrequent. Kendra, now 32, had become a successful marketing director, but she carried herself with a subtle tension whenever family conversations turned to her career or personal life. She had learned to share less and less about her challenges at work or her dating life, knowing that her father's responses often left her feeling inadequate rather than supported. Ashton, 29, and working as a high school English teacher, had grown increasingly quiet during family gatherings, offering polite responses but rarely engaging in the deeper conversations that once characterized their relationship. Both children loved their father deeply, but they had begun to dread the well-meaning conversations that somehow always left them feeling judged and found wanting. The upcoming Thanksgiving dinner would reveal exactly how these daily communication patterns had slowly eroded what should have been their strongest family bonds. If you're finding value in this perspective, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights on strengthening family relationships. The Thanksgiving dinner at Bryce's suburban home began like so many others, with the familiar sounds of preparation and the warm aroma of traditional dishes filling the comfortable living spaces his family had gathered in for decades. Kendra arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the polite smile she had perfected for family occasions. She hugged her father warmly, genuinely happy to see him, yet already bracing herself for the inevitable questions about her life that would follow. Ashton arrived shortly after, greeting everyone with his characteristic quiet warmth, though Bryce noticed his son seemed more reserved than usual. As they settled around the dining table, Bryce felt the familiar satisfaction of having his family together, unaware that this evening would perfectly demonstrate why these gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable for his children. Discussion. Conversation began pleasantly enough, with updates about work, mutual friends, and the usual family news that connects generations. Kendra shared stories about her recent projects at the marketing firm, while Ashton talked about his students and the upcoming school play he was directing. Bryce listened with genuine interest, proud of both his children's accomplishments and eager to contribute his own insights to their experiences. However, as the evening progressed, the subtle patterns that had been developing over years began to emerge, turning what should have been supportive family conversation into something that would leave both children feeling diminished and misunderstood. When Kendra mentioned that she had recently lost a major client at work, explaining the complex market factors and internal politics that had contributed to the situation, Bryce's immediate response revealed the first toxic pattern that had been slowly eroding their relationship. "When I was your age, I already had my life figured out," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone sharing hard-earned wisdom. "I knew exactly what I wanted from my career, and I went after it without all this uncertainty you seem to have." Kendra's face tightened almost imperceptibly, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth as she absorbed the familiar sting of comparison that made her current struggles seem like personal failures rather than normal professional challenges. What Bryce intended as encouragement and perspective landed as judgment and inadequacy. In his mind, he was offering his daughter the benefit of his experience, showing her that clarity and determination could solve her current difficulties. But what Kendra heard was that her father viewed her as indecisive and behind in life. That her career setbacks indicated some fundamental flaw in her character or planning abilities. The comparison to his younger self, meant to inspire, instead made her feel that she was failing to meet standards he had apparently achieved effortlessly decades earlier. She nodded politely and changed the subject, but the warmth in her voice had noticeably cooled. Ashton, who had been listening to this exchange while mentally preparing to share his own work challenges, began to explain the difficulties he was facing with classroom management and administrative pressures at his school. He described the complex dynamics of teaching teenagers in an underfunded district, the emotional toll of trying to reach students who faced significant challenges at home, and his frustration with policies that seemed to prioritize test scores over genuine learning. As he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who cared deeply about his work, but felt overwhelmed by circumstances largely beyond his control. Bryce listened for a few minutes before interrupting with the second toxic statement that would further distance his son. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, with the matter-of-fact tone he had used throughout his career to cut through what he saw as unnecessary complexity. Teaching is teaching. You show up, you do your job, you don't take it home with you. All this emotional stuff you're talking about just makes everything more complicated than it has to be. He reached for his wine glass, satisfied that he had offered practical advice that could simplify his son's professional struggles. Ashton felt the familiar frustration rise in his chest as his father dismissed the very aspects of teaching that made it meaningful to him. The statement invalidated not just his current struggles, but his entire approach to his profession and his deep commitment to his students' well-being. In Bryce's mind, he was helping his son see past unnecessary complications to focus on the essential job requirements. But what Ashton heard was that his father viewed his dedication and emotional investment as weaknesses, that his struggles were self-created rather than responses to real systemic challenges. The dismissal of his emotional stuff particularly stung, reducing his professional expertise and personal values to mere overthinking. As the evening continued, both Kendra and Ashton found themselves sharing less and responding with increasingly polite but distant acknowledgments to their father's comments. They had learned from years of similar conversations that expressing disagreement or hurt feelings would only lead to lectures about being too sensitive or not appreciating good advice. Instead, they employed the protective strategies they had developed, steering conversations towards safer topics and maintaining emotional distance even while physically present at the family table. The final blow came as they were clearing the dinner dishes, when both children mentioned aspects of their personal relationships they were navigating. Kendra spoke briefly about a recent breakup, while Ashton mentioned some tension with a friend over different life priorities. Bryce, seeing an opportunity to share valuable life lessons, prefaced his response with the third toxic statement that would ensure this Thanksgiving would be their last comfortable family gathering for months to come. "I'm just trying to help you avoid my mistakes," Bryce said, settling back into his chair with the weight of parental authority. He then proceeded to offer detailed advice about relationship choices, communication strategies, and life priorities, drawing extensively from his own experiences and the lessons he believed he had learned from his various successes and failures. In his mind, this was the most valuable gift he could offer his adult children, the wisdom to avoid the pitfalls he had encountered and the benefit of his decades of life experience. However, what Kendra and Ashton heard was the implication that their current life choices were destined for failure, that their judgment was so poor they needed constant correction to avoid disaster. The phrase suggested that without his intervention, they were naturally inclined toward the same mistakes he had made, viewing their independence and decision-making abilities as fundamentally flawed. Rather than feeling supported by his wisdom, they felt patronized and mistrusted, as if their father saw them as permanent children who would never develop their own reliable judgment. The evening ended with both children leaving earlier than planned, offering polite thanks and promises to call soon that everyone knew would be delayed as long as reasonably possible. Bryce stood in his doorway watching them drive away, genuinely confused about why his attempts to be helpful and engaged seemed to push them further from him. He had shared his experience, offered practical advice, and tried to guide them through their challenges. Yet somehow the warm family connection he wanted seemed more elusive than ever. This pattern that played out during Bryce's Thanksgiving dinner illustrates the three most common ways loving parents unknowingly damage their relationships with adult children through daily communication. The first category involves comparison and inadequacy, where parents use their own experiences as measuring sticks that make their children feel behind or insufficient. When Bryce told Kendra he had his life figured out at her age, he created a comparison that transformed her normal career challenges into personal failures. The second category involves dismissal and minimization, where parents invalidate their children's experiences by suggesting they are overcomplicating simple situations. Bryce's response to Ashton's teaching struggles dismissed not just his current difficulties, but his professional expertise and emotional investment in his work. This type of statement tells adult children that their perspectives and experiences don't matter, that their father's simplified view of their complex reality is more valid than their lived experience. The third category involves unsolicited correction disguised as wisdom sharing, where parents position themselves as necessary guides to prevent their children from making inevitable mistakes. When Bryce prefaced his relationship advice with helping them avoid his mistakes, he implied that their judgment was so unreliable they needed constant intervention to make sound decisions. This undermines their confidence and autonomy while positioning the parent as perpetually superior in wisdom and experience. What makes these patterns particularly destructive is their cumulative effect over time. No single conversation destroys a relationship, but months and years of similar exchanges gradually erode the mutual respect and emotional safety that healthy adult relationships require. Adult children begin to associate family contact with feelings of inadequacy, judgment, and frustration, leading them to limit communication and avoid gatherings to protect their emotional well-being. The tragedy is that parents like Bryce genuinely love their children and want strong relationships with them. Their toxic statements stem from deep care and concern, not malice or indifference. However, good intentions don't prevent harmful impact, and these daily communication patterns can destroy the very connections they're meant to strengthen. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for any parent who wants to rebuild damaged relationships or prevent existing ones from deteriorating further. Please subscribe to our channel for more insights on transforming these challenging family dynamics into stronger, more connected relationships. To help you see this pattern more clearly, I want to tell you another story that shows how loneliness and good intentions can create equally destructive communication patterns. This story involves a recently retired mother whose newfound freedom became the foundation for a different but equally harmful set of daily interactions with her adult children. Valencia had worked as a pediatric nurse for 37 years, dedicating her life to caring for children and families during their most vulnerable moments. At 64, she had finally retired with a comfortable pension and the expectation that she would now have time to enjoy deeper relationships with her own adult children. For decades, her demanding work schedule had limited their conversations to brief check-ins and holiday gatherings. But retirement promised the luxury of unhurried connection and the opportunity to be more present in Parker and Sage's lives. What she didn't anticipate was how her sudden abundance of free time would transform her natural maternal concern into a suffocating pattern of daily communication that would drive both children away. Parker, her 35-year-old son, worked as a software engineer from his home office, an arrangement that had served him well for several years. He valued the quiet concentration his remote work provided and had established routines that balanced his professional responsibilities with his personal need for solitude and reflection. He loved his mother deeply and had always appreciated their weekly phone conversations, which felt natural and connecting without being intrusive. However, 6 months into Valencia's retirement, their communication dynamic had shifted dramatically, with daily calls that felt more like interrogations than loving conversations. Sage, Valencia's 38-year-old daughter, was navigating the complex demands of single parenthood after her recent divorce, balancing a demanding job with raising 2 young children largely on her own. Her days were packed with work deadlines, school pickups, homework help, and the endless logistics of managing a household independently. She had always turned to her mother for support during difficult times, and Valencia's availability had initially felt like a blessing during this challenging life transition. However, what began as welcome support had gradually transformed into daily pressure that added stress rather than comfort to her already overwhelming schedule. The pattern began innocently enough, with Valencia calling both children every morning after her coffee, genuinely excited to connect and curious about their daily lives. In her mind, these calls represented the loving involvement she had been unable to provide during her working years, a chance to finally be the present and engaged mother she had always wanted to be. She approached these conversations with the same caring attention she had brought to her nursing career, naturally attuned to any signs that her children might need help or support. However, what Valencia experienced as caring attention, her children began to experience as invasive monitoring. Parker, who had always been somewhat introverted and prone to natural fluctuations in energy and mood, found himself dreading his mother's daily emotional assessments. When he answered her calls, sounding tired after a late night of work or simply less enthusiastic than she expected, Valencia's immediate response revealed the 4th toxic statement that was slowly poisoning their relationship. "You sound different. What's wrong with you?" became Valencia's standard opening after the usual greetings, delivered with the clinical concern of someone trained to identify problems that needed solving. In her mind, this question demonstrated her attentiveness and care, her ability to detect subtle changes that might indicate her son needed support. She saw herself as being more present and involved than she had been during his childhood, finally able to provide the detailed attention that her career had often prevented. But Parker experienced this daily interrogation as an invasion of his natural emotional privacy and a demand that he justify his normal human variations in mood and energy. The question implied that any deviation from cheerful enthusiasm required explanation and potential intervention, that his natural states were somehow concerning or abnormal. He began to feel like he was under constant surveillance, that every conversation required him to perform emotional stability to avoid triggering his mother's concern and the lengthy discussions that inevitably followed her worry. Over time, Parker found himself screening his mother's calls more and more frequently, knowing that answering required either genuine emotional energy he didn't always have, or the exhausting performance of artificial cheerfulness to avoid her probing questions. When he did answer, and the conversation naturally reached its conclusion after 10 or 15 minutes of genuine connection, Valencia would deploy the 5th toxic statement that made every interaction feel like a manipulation rather than a loving exchange. "I guess I'm not important enough for a longer conversation," she would say, with the wounded tone of someone whose feelings had been hurt by his natural conversational boundaries. In Valencia's mind, this statement expressed her genuine disappointment and her desire for more connection with her son. She felt that 10 or 15 minutes was insufficient after months of limited contact during her working years, and she wanted Parker to understand how much these conversations meant to her during her adjustment to retirement. However, Parker heard this statement as emotional manipulation designed to make him feel guilty for having normal boundaries around conversation length and availability. The phrase suggested that brief conversations indicated a lack of love or prioritization, that his time limitations reflected poorly on his character rather than simply representing the natural rhythms of adult communication. He began to feel that every conversation was a test he was destined to fail, that no amount of connection would ever satisfy his mother's needs without sacrificing his own well-being and autonomy. The situation became even more complicated when Valencia began comparing her children's communication patterns, creating competition and resentment where none had existed before. During her daily calls with Sage, she would frequently mention Parker's calling habits, saying things like, "Everyone else's kids call them more often," lumping Parker's communication style in with unnamed other families she had apparently surveyed about their adult children's contact frequency. This sixth toxic statement created multiple layers of damage to the family dynamic. For Parker, it meant that his communication with his mother was constantly being measured against external standards and found inadequate, that his love and respect were being quantified by metrics that had nothing to do with the actual quality of their relationship. For Sage, it meant that her own efforts to maintain connection were being used as weapons against her brother, turning her natural responsiveness into a source of family conflict rather than family strength. Sage began to feel uncomfortable, knowing that her conversations with her mother were being used to critique Parker's availability, and she started to resent being positioned as the good child in comparison to her brother's supposed inadequacy. The comparison also created pressure for her to maintain a level of communication that might not be sustainable given her demanding life circumstances, knowing that any reduction in contact might result in her being moved into the inadequate category alongside Parker. The toxic pattern escalated when Parker, overwhelmed by the daily emotional demands and guilt-inducing conversations, began to limit his availability even further. His natural response to feeling controlled was to assert boundaries by screening calls more frequently and keeping conversations shorter when he did answer. This perfectly reasonable response to manipulative communication triggered Valencia's abandonment fears and intensified her efforts to maintain connection through increasingly guilt-laden statements. Valencia's loneliness, which was real and understandable given her major life transition, had transformed into a communication style that prioritized her emotional needs over her children's autonomy and well-being. Her daily interrogations about their emotional states, her guilt-inducing responses to natural conversation boundaries, and her comparisons between her children's communication habits all served her need for connection, while simultaneously destroying the very relationships she was trying to strengthen. Parker eventually stopped answering most of his mother's calls, communicating primarily through text messages that allowed him to maintain connection while protecting himself from the emotional manipulation he had come to associate with their phone conversations. He still loved his mother deeply, but he had learned that preserving their relationship required limiting the ways she could access and influence his emotional state on a daily basis. Sage, meanwhile, developed significant anxiety before every phone call with her mother, knowing that the conversation would likely include guilt-inducing statements about Parker's communication habits, probing questions about her own emotional state, and resistance to natural conversational boundaries, what had once been a source of comfort and support during her difficult divorce and adjustment to single parenthood, had become another source of stress in an already overwhelming life. The second category of toxic daily statements that Valencia unknowingly deployed falls under guilt-tripping and manipulation. These statements use emotional pressure to control adult children's behavior, making them feel selfish or inadequate for having normal boundaries around availability and communication. Unlike direct commands or obvious manipulation, these statements operate through implication and emotional inference, making them particularly difficult for loving adult children to resist or address directly. When Valencia asked Parker what was wrong with him based on subtle changes in his voice or energy level, she was essentially demanding that he make his internal emotional states available for her inspection and concern. This type of daily interrogation treats adult children like patients or problems to be monitored rather than independent individuals, with natural variations in mood and energy. When she expressed hurt over normal conversation boundaries, she was using her emotions as tools to extend interactions beyond what felt natural or comfortable for her children. This manipulation technique makes adult children feel responsible for managing their parents' emotional responses to reasonable limits, turning every interaction into a potential source of guilt and conflict. When she compared her children's communication habits to unnamed other families, she was using external standards to make her children feel inadequate about their natural communication styles and availability. This technique creates artificial competition and resentment, while making children feel that their love is being constantly measured and found insufficient. These patterns are particularly damaging because they exploit the natural love and respect that adult children feel for their parents, using those positive emotions as leverage to control behavior and increase contact. The result is that children begin to associate family communication with feelings of manipulation and guilt, leading them to limit contact to protect their emotional well-being rather than increase it to strengthen family bonds. Subscribe to our channel if you want more content like this that helps you recognize and transform these destructive family communication patterns. Nothing explains this better than the story I'm about to tell you, which reveals how even the most well-intentioned parents can use their age and experience as weapons rather than wisdom, creating the final category of toxic statements that completely shut down meaningful communication with adult children. Camden had always prided himself on being a straightforward man who didn't mince words or waste time on what he considered unnecessary emotional complications. At 71, he was a recently widowed former construction foreman who had spent decades leading teams, solving problems, and making decisions based on practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. His wife's death 8 months earlier had left him struggling not just with grief, but with a profound sense of losing control over his life circumstances. The man who had once managed complex construction projects with confidence now felt adrift in a world that seemed to have changed beyond his understanding, and his relationships with his adult children had become casualties of his desperate attempts to maintain authority and relevance. His daughter Iris was 45 years old and worked as a licensed family therapist, a profession that brought her deep satisfaction but also created complicated dynamics within her own family relationships. She had spent years helping other families navigate communication challenges and emotional conflicts, yet found herself increasingly unable to connect with her own father in meaningful ways. The irony of being professionally skilled at facilitating healthy family relationships while watching her own family connections deteriorate was not lost on her, and it added layers of frustration and self-doubt to her already strained relationship with Camden. River Camden's 42-year-old son had built a successful career as a restaurant chef, combining creativity with the practical skills and work ethic his father had instilled in him during his childhood. He loved the fast-paced, demanding world of professional cooking, but he had grown increasingly exhausted by the emotional demands of family interactions that felt more like battles than conversations. Over the past 8 months, he had gradually reduced his contact with his father, finding excuses to avoid family dinners and limiting their interactions to brief surface-level conversations that minimized opportunities for conflict. The breaking point came when both children, despite their different approaches to family relationships, realized that their father's isolation and their family's deteriorating communication patterns required professional intervention. After months of Camden's children avoiding him and his growing bitterness about their apparent lack of respect and concern, Iris finally convinced him to attend family therapy sessions at a local community center. Camden agreed reluctantly, viewing the therapy as evidence of his children's weakness and oversensitivity, but hoping it might help them understand and appreciate his perspective. The community center where they met was a modest building that hosted various support groups and counseling services, providing a neutral environment away from the loaded history of family homes and familiar spaces. Camden arrived for their first session with the defensive posture of someone who expected to be ganged up on, convinced that his children had conspired to paint him as the problem in their relationship difficulties. He sat stiffly in his chair, arms crossed, already formulating arguments about how his children had become ungrateful and overly emotional since his wife's death. Iris and River entered the session with their own mixture of hope and resignation, both wanting to rebuild their relationship with their father, but exhausted by months of failed attempts to communicate with him. They had reached the point where professional mediation seemed like their last chance to create the kind of honest dialogue that could either repair their family bonds or help them understand why those bonds had become so damaged. The therapist, a calm and experienced professional who specialized in family communication issues, began by asking each family member to share their perspective on the current state of their relationships. When Iris spoke first, she tried to explain how her father's communication style had changed since her mother's death, becoming more critical and dismissive of her professional expertise and personal experiences. She chose her words carefully, drawing on her own therapeutic training to express her concerns in ways that focused on behavior rather than character, hoping to minimize her father's defensiveness. Camden's response to his daughter's gentle attempt at honest communication revealed the seventh toxic statement that had been systematically destroying their relationship. "You're being too sensitive about everything," he said, with the dismissive tone of someone who considered emotional awareness a character flaw rather than a valuable skill. In his mind, this statement cut through what he saw as unnecessary psychological complexity to address the real issue, which was his children's inability to handle straightforward communication and practical guidance. What made this statement particularly devastating was that Camden was dismissing not just his daughter's feelings, but her professional expertise and years of education in understanding human emotional dynamics. Iris had dedicated her career to helping families navigate exactly the kind of communication challenges they were experiencing. Yet her father reduced her concerns to simple oversensitivity. The statement invalidated both her personal experience and her professional knowledge, suggesting that her understanding of healthy communication was merely emotional weakness disguised as expertise. River, who had been listening to this exchange, while gathering courage to share his own experiences, decided to challenge his father's outdated approaches to family relationships and business advice. He explained how the restaurant industry had evolved significantly since Camden's early career, requiring different management styles, communication approaches, and customer service strategies than the construction industry Camden knew. He described specific situations where his father's advice, while well-intentioned, simply didn't apply to the realities of modern restaurant management and the complex interpersonal dynamics of leading creative kitchen teams. Camden's response revealed the eighth toxic statement that had been shutting down meaningful dialogue between them for months. "I've lived longer, so I know better," he declared, with the absolute certainty of someone who viewed age as an automatic guarantee of superior wisdom and judgment. In Camden's worldview, his decades of life experience gave him authority over any situation, regardless of how much circumstances had changed or how much specialized knowledge his children had developed in their respective fields. This statement effectively ended any possibility of genuine conversation or mutual learning between Camden and his children. By positioning his age as the ultimate trump card in any disagreement, he made it impossible for River to share relevant expertise or for either child to contribute meaningfully to family discussions. The statement suggested that their current perspectives and experiences were inherently less valuable than his past experiences. Regardless of relevance or applicability to current circumstances, the therapy session reached its breaking point when both Iris and River tried to explain how their father's inflexibility and dismissive communication style had made them feel unheard and undervalued in their adult relationship. They spoke about wanting to maintain connection while feeling increasingly frustrated by conversations that felt more like lectures than exchanges, where their opinions and experiences were consistently devalued in favor of their father's historical perspective. Camden's final response revealed the ninth toxic statement that completed the pattern of dismissal and invalidation that had driven both children away. "You'll understand when you're my age," he said, with the patronizing tone of someone speaking to children who simply lacked the maturity to grasp adult realities. This statement effectively dismissed everything his children had said as the inevitable ignorance of youth, suggesting that their current perspectives were worthless and that only his life experience provided valid insight into their family dynamics. This final toxic statement was perhaps the most destructive because it completely shut down any possibility of mutual respect or adult conversation. By telling his children that their current understanding was inherently inadequate and would only become valid when they reached his age, Camden positioned himself as the sole authority on family relationships while reducing his adult children to perpetual students who had nothing valuable to contribute to family discussions. Through the guided therapy sessions that followed, Camden slowly began to recognize how these daily dismissals had accumulated into an impenetrable wall between him and his children. River, who had initially been reluctant to participate in family therapy, found the courage to reveal that he had been avoiding family dinners for 8 months, specifically because every conversation became a lecture where his feelings and opinions were systematically dismissed and invalidated. The revelation was devastating. For Camden, who genuinely loved his children and had been interpreting their distance as evidence of their ingratitude and disrespect, rather than a natural response to his dismissive communication patterns. He had been using his age and experience as tools of dismissal rather than connection, making his adult children feel perpetually childish and unheard whenever they tried to engage with him on equal terms. River's confession that he had been avoiding family contact for months helped Camden understand that his communication style wasn't just creating temporary disagreements, but was actually driving away the relationships he valued most. The man who prided himself on practical problem-solving began to see that his approach to family communication was creating the very problems he wanted to solve. The third category of toxic daily statements that Camden unknowingly deployed involves dismissal and invalidation, where parents use their age and experience to shut down their children's perspectives rather than engage with them respectfully. These statements position parents as perpetual authorities and children as perpetual students, making adult conversation and mutual respect impossible. When Camden told Iris she was being too sensitive, he was dismissing her emotional intelligence and professional expertise as character flaws rather than valuable skills. This type of statement tells adult children that their emotional awareness and communication abilities are weaknesses rather than strengths, invalidating their personal growth and professional development. When he used his age as authority to dismiss River's expertise, he was prioritizing chronological experience over relevant knowledge and current understanding. This approach makes it impossible for adult children to contribute meaningfully to family discussions or share their own insights and expertise. When he told both children they would understand when they were his age, he was essentially saying their current perspectives were worthless and would only become valid through aging rather than through their own experiences and learning. This statement treats adult children like permanent adolescents whose opinions and feelings don't deserve serious consideration. These patterns show how parents can use their age and experience as weapons rather than wisdom, creating communication dynamics that make their adult children feel perpetually diminished and unheard. The result is that children begin to avoid family contact, not because they don't love their parents, but because every interaction reinforces their sense of being treated like children rather than respected as adults. Please like this video if you're finding these insights helpful for understanding your own family communication patterns. These 3 stories reveal the 9 toxic daily statements that loving parents unknowingly use to push their adult children away, creating walls instead of bridges in the relationships they treasure most. Bryce's holiday dinner disaster showed us how comparison and inadequacy statements destroy confidence and connection. Valencia's suffocating phone patterns demonstrated how guilt-tripping and manipulation poison the very conversations meant to strengthen family bonds. Camden's community center revelation exposed how dismissal and invalidation shut down adult communication entirely. Together, these patterns explain why so many dedicated parents find themselves confused and hurt by their children's growing distance. The first category, comparison and inadequacy, includes statements like, "When I was your age, I already had my life figured out. You're making this harder than it needs to be, and I'm just trying to help you avoid my mistakes." These phrases use your past experiences as measuring sticks that make your children feel inadequate and behind in life. They transform normal life challenges into personal failures and position you as the standard your children can never quite meet. While you intend to offer wisdom and perspective, your children hear judgment and disappointment that accumulates over time into deep feelings of inadequacy. The second category, guilt, tripping, and manipulation, includes statements like, "You sound different. What's wrong with you? I guess I'm not important enough for a longer conversation, and everyone else's kids call them more often." These phrases use emotional pressure to control your children's behavior and availability, making them feel selfish for having normal boundaries. They turn natural conversations into tests your children are destined to fail and create artificial competition that breeds resentment. Your loneliness and desire for connection, while understandable, becomes a weapon that destroys the very relationships you're trying to strengthen. The third category, dismissal and invalidation, includes statements like, "You're being too sensitive about everything. I've lived longer, so I know better, and you'll understand when you're my age." These phrases use your age and experience to shut down your children's perspectives rather than engage with them respectfully. They position you as the permanent authority and your children as permanent students, making adult conversation impossible. While you believe you're sharing valuable wisdom, your children experience these statements as complete dismissal of their intelligence, expertise, and emotional maturity. What makes these patterns particularly destructive is their cumulative effect over months and years of daily interactions. No single statement destroys a relationship, but the constant repetition of these toxic phrases gradually erodes the mutual respect and emotional safety that healthy adult relationships require. Your children, begin to associate family contact with feelings of inadequacy, manipulation, and dismissal, leading them to limit communication to protect their emotional well-being rather than increase it to strengthen family bonds. The universal pattern underlying all 9 statements is that they prioritize your needs, perspectives, and emotions over your children's autonomy and dignity as adults. Whether you're making comparisons that highlight their inadequacies, using guilt to manipulate their availability, or dismissing their perspectives as inherently inferior to yours, you're treating them like extensions of yourself, rather than independent individuals deserving of respect and consideration. The solution requires recognizing these patterns and replacing them with communication that validates your children's experiences, respects their boundaries, and demonstrates genuine curiosity about their lives rather than constant correction and comparison. Instead of telling them how things were when you were their age, ask them about their current experiences and listen without immediately offering solutions. Instead of guilt-tripping them about conversation length or frequency, express gratitude for the time they do share and respect their natural limits. Instead of dismissing their perspectives as oversensitivity or inexperience, acknowledge their expertise and emotional intelligence as valuable contributions to family conversations. This transformation isn't about walking on eggshells or avoiding honest communication, but rather about learning to express your love in ways your children can receive and appreciate. It means shifting from a parent-child dynamic to an adult-adult relationship that honors both your wisdom and their growth. The goal is to become someone your children want to call, rather than someone they feel obligated to contact. Someone whose advice feels supportive rather than critical, and someone who adds joy rather than stress to their already complex lives. Think about your own communication patterns with your adult children. Which of these 9 toxic statements do you recognize in your daily conversations? How might your well-intentioned attempts to help and guide be experienced by your children as judgment and control? What would it look like to replace comparison with curiosity, guilt with gratitude, and dismissal with genuine interest in their perspectives? The choice is yours. You can continue using these toxic daily statements and watch your relationships slowly deteriorate, or you can begin the challenging but rewarding work of transforming how you communicate with the adult children you love. Your children are waiting for the parent who sees them as capable adults, worthy of respect, rather than permanent children in need of constant correction. How are you going to apply these lessons to rebuild the warm, connected relationships you both deserve? If this content has inspired you to examine and improve your family communication patterns, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights on strengthening these precious relationships.